always a fantastic pleasure to be in your superb city with its appalling weather. I should make clear from the start so that the British ambassador doesn't have to spend his afternoon doing so. This is not the point of view of the United Kingdom. This is my point of view, which is slightly different to the point of view of the United Kingdom, I suspect. What I'm going to do today, and actually we had some cross wires that my secretary said to me yesterday, they want a 50-minute lecture. So I've written one, but I'm going to just talk about the politics and do it in 20 minutes. And I'm going to talk essentially about what's happened, what's going on, and what might happen next, which is going to be interesting because I don't really know the answer to that question, but I'm going to try and make one up for you. And in terms of what's happened, I just want to add some context to the debate about Brexit. Firstly, the British government has made a number of mistakes in handling this. I'm not going to deny that. I'm not for a moment suggesting that the European Union has handled this well either. I'm happy in conversation to talk about what I mean by that, but I think the EU's approach has left a lot to be desired. But in terms of what's happened in the United Kingdom, I just want to make a few points. Firstly, I suspect that the process would have worked very differently if the person appointed as Prime Minister in July 2016 had been a full-throated Leave campaigner, rather than Theresa May, who, of course, however, grudgingly supported Remain. And I say that based on a kind of logic of only Nixon could go to China. One of the problems that Theresa May faced from the outset was her first priority, as she saw it, was to prove her credentials to the European Research Group. And because of that, she tacked very strongly towards a hard Brexit position to prove those credentials. Whereas I suspect, had we had someone like a Michael Gove or a Boris Johnson from the start, achieving a softer outcome would have been significantly easier. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, Mrs. May made several tactical errors along the way. Firstly, laying down those red lines at the Conservative Party conference in October 2016, couching it in the language of citizens of nowhere, having Amber Rudd talk about EU nationals having to register. I think you cannot underestimate the impact that had on the EU27, particularly because that conference took place before the Prime Minister had actually met the European Council. So their first impressions were formed by that, and those red lines blocked her in to a significant extent in the negotiations that followed. Secondly, triggering Article 50 with no clear sense of purpose was probably not the best thing to do. The government needed to have some kind of idea of what it wanted before triggering Article 50. They had to an extent, but I'm not sure to a good enough extent. And I think the most egregious errors, the final two most egregious errors, were firstly continuing to act as if the government had a significant majority after the election of 2017. After the election of 2017, it was absolutely obvious, given the numbers in Parliament, that some kind of cross-party agreement would be needed to get Brexit over the line, and yet the Prime Minister did not acknowledge this until only a few months ago, by which time it was far, far too late. And secondly, failing completely to sell the withdrawal agreement she'd negotiated. I mean, think what you will about Brexit and about leaving the European Union, but the withdrawal agreement is actually an incredibly sophisticated and rather clever document that manages to square a number of circles that on the surface appeared unsquareable. But the Prime Minister came home with this document and then didn't do anything. She didn't spend hours in Parliament explaining to MPs what the benefit of the deal she'd signed was. In fact, she went back into her bunker and allowed the Eurosceptics the time and the space to set the narrative, which they did, and which culminated in that first thrashing of the withdrawal agreement in Parliament way back in January. All this being said, let me make 3 points just to say, in a sense, it wasn't all the fault of the British government. Firstly, leaving the European Union is an intrinsically very, very difficult thing to do. Whatever country you are, whoever your Prime Minister is, however big their majority might be, unpicking the relationship that membership of the European Union implies and doing it within the rather ridiculous 2-year timetable set by Article 50 would be a challenge for anyone, okay? Secondly, doing so in a country that is profoundly divided down the middle when it comes to Brexit is all the more problematic. And I'll come back onto that in a minute, because I don't think you can make too much of the point that the British people are split down the middle, and finding a compromise is very, very difficult, if not impossible. And the final thing to bear in mind is Brexit came along at a time when the British state was confronting a number of other crises, which we hadn't actually noticed, but which were brewing. There was a crisis of devolution brewing because of the Scottish referendum of 2014. The SNP were never going to go away and say, okay, that's fine, we've lost, let's stay in the United Kingdom. There was an economic crisis brewing because of growing dissatisfaction with the impact of austerity and growing inequality. There was a political crisis brewing because of increasing distrust of politics that you can date back to the expenses crisis of 2008 and even before. You see it in terms of falling turnout, less participation in politics, growing distrust of political parties. And there was a crisis brewing in Northern Ireland where the Stormont government was wobbling already. And where some sort of crisis was going to break out. Now, the thing is that Brexit comes along and is added on to all these crises, and, to make matters worse, it makes each of these crises even worse than it was beforehand. So the British government has got an awful lot on its hands to deal with while dealing with this Brexit issue. So what's happening in our politics? Let me take you back to the 29th of March. The 29th of March, dubbed by some, rather hastily as it turns out, Independence Day. 29th of March was also the day on which we had the third meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement. It was different from the first two because the only thing voted on was the withdrawal agreement itself and not the political declaration that accompanies it. And I remember on the 29th of March, I was in the House of Commons, I had breakfast with 9 or 10 Labour MPs. This wasn't some sort of sit, this was a bacon roll and a coffee. I don't want you to get the impression that this was sort of parliamentary splendour. And 7 of them said to me, we're going to vote for the deal. And I thought, wow, blimey, the deal's going to get through. Halfway through that morning, the Prime Minister's spokesperson said something to the press along the lines of, obviously, if this vote fails, we might have no option but to have a general election. At which point, my phone starts buzzing with these same Labour MPs texting me saying, well, I could have supported the Prime Minister beforehand to get Brexit over the line, but what I cannot do is now give her my vote if it looks like I'm supporting a Conservative government that otherwise might fall, or call a general election if I vote against, which was interesting. And of course, when push came to shove and we had that vote, I think all but 3 Labour MPs opposed a withdrawal agreement that the official Labour Party line is a fine agreement and can't be changed. We get that. The Labour Party voted against the deal it agrees with. Okay? So, fast forward to the following Monday when we had, and I apologise for the fact that British politics now sounds like a number of sort of really bad film sequels, but on the Monday we had indicative votes too. Okay? Return of the options. So, in indicative votes too, a number of options were voted on in Parliament, customs union, single market, referendum, and a number of Conservative MPs who are actually quite sympathetic to a customs union or single market voted against those options. Why? Because they were furious with the Labour Party for having voted against the withdrawal agreement the following Friday. So you have a curious dichotomy in our politics. On the one hand, Brexit divides our political parties down the middle. On the other hand, the Brexit debate has firmed up the tribalism that divides the parties from each other and makes cross-party agreement very, very difficult to secure. Okay? And that's essentially what was going on with all these votes. Now, I understand it is very easy to look at Britain and look at our parliamentary debates and smile now. And lots of people are doing it. There was a week in January of this year where the viewing figures for BBC Parliament exceeded the viewing figures for MTV for the first time in the history of those two channels. So people find this sort of interesting, okay? But what I would argue on one level at least is that Parliament is working absolutely perfectly. Parliament is divided, it is polarised, it is angry, it is uncertain, and it simply does not know what it wants. And in that respect, it perfectly mirrors the British people. The British people are divided down the middle on Brexit. And if you look at that slide, which is basically we gave British people an option, all the Brexit options, hard Brexit, soft Brexit, Mrs May's deal, no deal. You could not find a majority for any one of those options amongst the British people. And what is more, if you try to use a transferable vote method, the method you use determines which option wins. And each method used, commonly in other countries, would give you a different outcome. So my point is, it is not just Parliament that is divided, it is the British people. The British people themselves do not know and have no majority for any kind of Brexit outcome. And before I go on to the substance, let me just say one more thing. We are a country that is profoundly divided, and you can all see it. You can see it by watching British Parliament, you can see it by reading our newspapers. We are polarised. And our polarisation is out in the open and being fought over day by day in our politics. if you like, what we've done is we've shaken the champagne bottle and popped the cork, and it's all out there for people to see. Now, compare France. France is a country that is as polarised, if not more so, than the United Kingdom. In the last presidential election, 42% of French people voted for either Jean-Luc Mélenchon or Le Pen. Okay? The extremes of the political spectrum. But the French have an electoral system that is so effectively, well, for want of a better word, rigged, that those 42%, for their trouble, got Emmanuel Macron, who is about as far from Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Le Pen as you could hope to get. My point is that what happens in France is profound social polarisation does not get reflected in electoral outcomes. It is no surprise, therefore, that it is in France where you see the Gilets jaunes protests breaking out, because there is a sense that the system does not respond to what the people want. Now, if you buy my assertion that France and the United Kingdom are essentially equally polarised societies, and that one has popped the champagne cork, and if you want the analogy for France, we've shaken the champagne bottle but kept our foot on the cork to keep it in, I do not know which of those systems has chosen the most effective way to deal with polarisation, but what I would suggest is no one knows. And we'll only know in 5 to 10 years' time. So my opening salvo about Britain, as the ambassador looks on, is do not write Britain off, because we might have happened upon the best way of doing this, because at least we're dealing with this openly in our parliament, and we're acknowledging the divisions that exist in our society. Now, the key to what is happening in British politics is what is happening inside the two big political parties. And that is what I want to talk about very briefly. Now, I'm going to start with the Labour Party. Had we left the European Union on the 29th of March, as we were meant to, Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit policies would have been an unmitigated triumph. Okay, ponder that. That is why I say this. This diagram shows the change in vote share between the 2015 and the 2017 general election. On the left are constituencies that voted heavily Remain. On the right are constituencies that voted heavily Leave. What you will see is Labour increased its vote share across the board. How did they do this? They did this by producing a manifesto that was so absolutely impenetrably confusing that no one knew what Labour's Brexit policy was. Okay? You might think that's a bad thing. Electorally, it turned out to be quite a good thing. Labour kept together its Leave and Remain coalition and managed to do so pretty well for the succeeding months. But of course, that coalition is starting to break apart now, because we didn't leave on the 29th of March, and people want the Labour Party to take a position on this. Okay? Now, this is the change that's occurred. This is a bit complicated. Let me try and explain. These are the shifts in marginal seats that occurred between 2015 and 2017 in the general elections. To the left of the centre line are the seats that shifted towards the Conservatives. To the right are the seats that shifted towards Labour. On top of the line are the seats that voted Remain. Below the line are the seats that voted Leave. Ignore the names. The team in my office, whenever I ask them to do these things, stick on the places that we come from. They have no scientific value whatsoever. I come from Wakefield, if you care. But the point is that is based on numbers from 2016. That is based on numbers for 2019. So what you see is that the key marginals that the two parties are competing about have become more Remainery, because the British public opinion has shifted by about 3 or 4% towards Remain. That's why the Labour position on Brexit has softened since that general election, because public opinion has softened. Okay, and they're trying to keep in touch. So the Labour position isn't ideological, it isn't Marxist, it isn't irrational, it's based on public opinion. But the problem the Labour Party has is more and more people are dissatisfied with the ambiguity that worked so well in 2017. So Labour is facing a dilemma, but it's not an easy dilemma, and it's not an easy dilemma because, in a sense, different parts of the Labour Party see the problem they face differently. So let me show you this first. This is how Labour's 2017 voters would vote now, according to YouGov polling. So for those who are militating in favour of Labour becoming a party of Remain or a referendum, you look at that, you think 25% of the people who voted for us in 2017 would now vote Liberal Democrat. That's a crisis, so we have to adopt a Remain position in order to neutralise the threat from the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats are far more dangerous, according to that graphic, than the Brexit Party when it comes to Labour. But I don't know if you saw, but last week 26 Labour MPs wrote to Jeremy Corbyn saying we must not have a referendum, we must honour the referendum, we must do Brexit. Why? Because in their constituencies, they're the estimates. Okay, so it's very, very different to the national picture. So you have two contrasting views inside the Labour Party. I am not going to be silly enough to try and predict which will eventually triumph in the debates within the Labour Party over how we should proceed. All I would leave you with is the Labour leadership faces a genuinely difficult choice. Anyone who says it's absolutely obvious is lying. Because Labour is a coalition of Leavers and Remainers, the most Leave seats and the most Remain seats. And whichever option you choose, you are going to lose some voters. The question is, where do you lose the voters that matter? Because voters in marginal seats are infinitely more important to you than voters in safe seats. And that is quite a delicate calculation. Now, if you think that is complicated and messy, let me introduce you to the Conservative Party. And let me introduce you to the Conservative Party firstly with that rather appalling slide, which is a survey of Conservative Party members taken in March to try and get their views on no deal, which we're going to hear about in a minute. Delighted about no deal, pleased about no deal, relieved with no deal, wouldn't mind either way are the first four. Tory party members, so the people who pay money to the Tory parties and the people, bear this in mind, who are about to elect the new Prime Minister, are generally quite keen on no deal as an outcome of Brexit, okay? Which isn't great, but there we go, that's just the world we live in. Now, this has had an impact for a long time because essentially the Tory party has been having a leadership contest since July 2017. It started officially a few weeks ago, but actually from the moment Theresa May failed to get a majority in that election, she was, as George Osborne put it, a dead woman walking, and the candidates were out on parade. And one of the first things all the candidates did, with a few notable exceptions, because they'd seen these figures, is start to talk in positive terms about no deal. Because if you want the vote of those people, you can't be going around saying no deal would be dreadful, which it would, okay? And what happens then is a lot of people who should know better, our Foreign Secretary among them, who'd seen the warnings from the civil service, are now going around saying, well, it won't be as bad as people think. And one of the really, really nefarious consequences of this, because people still listen to government ministers, is that around 32% of the British public now think that a no deal would be the best outcome of Brexit. So we've created a little vicious circle going from this to ministers who want this lot to vote for them to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, to public opinion buying into it. And this was simply reinforced by the outcome of the European elections, where Conservatives now see the Brexit Party as a bigger threat than the Labour Party. So the Brexit Party is enemy number one if you're a Conservative, and your energy has to be focused on beating the Brexit Party, which is why all of a sudden 31st of October has become this totemic date for Boris Johnson, because actually it doesn't matter how you leave. What really matters is whether you leave on the 31st of October. Okay, so that in a sense is where we have landed now. Now, this is where it gets really ropey. Because of that, it is worth bearing in mind. This is a poll taken ages ago, but it's worth just emphasising the point about Conservative Party members. This was a poll of Conservative Party members, and all I would say is that other brackets please name comes ahead of anyone who supported Remain in the referendum. This is to give you an idea of the polarisation within the Conservative Party. This is a Brexit party in all but name. And just in parentheses, I will say, failing something dramatic happening, it seems to me inconceivable that anyone other than the guy on the top of that list is going to become our next Prime Minister. So, what next? Well, the first thing to say is, despite all the excitement, despite all the sort of, the joys of this leadership contest, the new Prime Minister will enter office and confront precisely the same three choices as his predecessor. You leave with a deal, you leave with no deal, or you do not leave. That's it. They are the only options, okay? Now, on the one hand, it is conceivable, though I would say not probable, that our new Prime Minister could go to Brussels and say, look, we either leave with no deal or you renegotiate the backstop. I don't think it is obvious that the EU slams the door in their face, simply because the one thing the Republic of Ireland wants less than a dilution of the backstop is a no-deal outcome. So I don't know what will happen then. I don't know whether the politics will have shifted. If you read the best British journalist on the negotiations is a guy called Peter Foster, who works for the Telegraph. He is now saying on Twitter quite regularly he thinks there is a potential for a renegotiation, but he adds, don't bet on it, but it is possible. So I don't know. If our new Prime Minister goes and gets a renegotiated deal, that could change the arithmetic. I think far more likely is that Boris Johnson goes to Brussels, changes a couple of commas in the withdrawal agreement, maybe gets it printed in a slightly different font, and comes back to Parliament and says, look, guys, I've renegotiated the withdrawal agreement. What do you think? All right. But the problem with that is that not only does the new Prime Minister face exactly the same options as the old Prime Minister, he will face exactly the same Parliament as the last Prime Minister, and that is a Parliament within which there is no majority for no deal, there is no majority for a deal, and there is no majority for not leaving. There is, in fact, no majority for anything, okay? Which, as I said, is a perfect reflection of the British people as well, so we shouldn't criticise the Parliament too much, but that's where we are. Now, what does that mean? Firstly, Parliament has the numbers to stop no deal, if they want to. They could do that in one of two ways. The Speaker has said he will make time available, so Parliament could try and vote on something like the Cooper-Letwin bill, which gives Parliament control over its timetable. I mean, for some people, it's remarkable that Parliament doesn't control its own timetable. We're a very executive-led system in the United Kingdom. And if Parliament gets control of its timetable, it could use some parliamentary wheeze to say to the Prime Minister, you cannot have no deal. Or the nuclear option, Parliament could pass a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. That would require Conservative MPs voting against their own government in a vote of no confidence, which would automatically lose them the whip and automatically lose them their jobs if we had another election. But so Parliament has it within its gift to stop no deal if it wants to, though it is far from certain it will. What the calculation being made in the head of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt is about now is about how best do you create a situation in which I can win a general election, okay? And essentially when it comes to this, you have three options. You could try and sign up to some sort of deal with the European Union and leave on the basis of a deal and then have a general election, though that will involve a delay. Because bear this in mind, there is no way the United Kingdom can leave with a deal before the 31st of October because there is simply not enough parliamentary sitting days to pass the withdrawal agreement bill that has to be passed before we leave. Okay, so that means a delay. I would suggest that any Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister, who delays beyond the 31st of October is in for a hammering from Nigel Farage when we finally have an election, particularly if they've signed up to something that looks like Theresa May's deal that Nigel Farage brands as Brexit in name only. Or the Prime Minister says, okay, I'm going to leave without a deal and go to the people after that. Let me just warn you very, very quickly. This, you probably don't remember this. Back in 2000 in Britain, we had a series of blockades of oil refineries, okay? If you talk to people like Alistair Campbell, they will say it was the one moment when Tony Blair was in Downing Street, forget Iraq, forget Kosovo, it was the one moment when they were truly worried about their grip on power. 3 days before the refinery strikes, Labour were polling at 50%, the Tories in the mid-30s, that was the status quo in our politics. 3 days after the refinery blockades was the one day in that Parliament where the Tories had a lead over Labour. The message is, we Brits, for all our talk about the Second World War, for all our talk about keeping calm and carrying on, we do not like crises. And we react badly to a government that allows a crisis to happen. We are a country where 2 summers ago, KFC ran out of chicken and thousands of people rang the police. Okay? So, I would suggest to you that a calculation that you could do no deal and then win an election, and the disruption caused by no deal would be significantly greater than just about running out of fuel, but not quite. It will be seen in the shops, it will be seen at the ports. However well we prepare, however much money the Treasury throws at it, no deal will cause disruptions. That would not work, which leaves us with one alternative. Our new Prime Minister could go into Downing Street, talk to his advisors, come back in September to the start of Parliament and call an election to happen before the 31st of October. Give me a mandate to give you the Brexit you voted for. In the hope, and this is the calculation, that you can get enough Brexit Party members to trust you and vote for the Conservative Party, and enough means more than Lib Dems who are willing to trust Jeremy Corbyn and vote for the Labour Party. So as long as Labour loses more votes to the Lib Dems than the Tories lose to the Brexit Party, you could win that election. It is a massive gamble, and I do not think for a moment that either of the contenders for the Tory party leadership will do it. But I would suggest that it is the most sensible way ahead. But if this doesn't happen, and I'll finish with this, and this is a prediction you can hold me to, and then you can tell me I was wrong. My sense at the moment, given the fact that anyone in Downing Street will come to comprehend the disruption that no deal will cause, is that the last week of October is going to look and feel uncannily like the last week of March. And we're going to have desperate scenes in Parliament, and our Prime Minister, whoever it is going to end up having to ask for that delay. That both of them are very reluctant now to say that they will. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And as you can see, I'm from University of Turku, and our new PowerPoint template has this lovely UKIP purple for some reason, so doesn't reflect my own political affiliation, I should say. Now, what I hope to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to talk about the legal implications of a no-deal Brexit. And to do this, what I want to do is I want to compare and contrast the withdrawal agreement scenario with the no-deal scenario. And obviously this is a huge and highly complex topic, so I'm only going to concentrate on what I think are the three key issues. And those are, number one, the citizens' rights, number two, the financial settlement, so what will the UK pay, and number three, trade, which then includes the question of the Irish border, because that question really is a question of trade arrangements. So let's look at, first of all, just the legal basics to remind ourselves what's the process. And the process, well, you see the key provision there, paragraph 2 of Article 50, which says that notification of the intention to withdraw, which was obviously delivered in March 2017, after which you will then have negotiations for a withdrawal agreement. And that withdrawal agreement indeed was negotiated, and we have the text of that. And like the provision says, what it deals with is arrangements for withdrawal, so issues immediately connected with the divorce, if you wish. Then there is also the issue of the future. So, and here Article 50 makes reference to future relations, and the way that was understood is that we don't negotiate at this point anything about the future relationship as such, but instead what we have done is we have come up with a political declaration on future relations, which is not legally binding and which sets out the general non-binding guidelines for negotiations that will then take place after the withdrawal. So today we have legally binding withdrawal agreement and non-binding set of guidelines that will cover future negotiations. Because don't think that negotiations stop when UK leaves. This is going to go on for years and years, without any doubt. But we, of course, know that the UK Parliament then did not, in the end, or at least at the moment, for the moment, accept the withdrawal agreement. Now, what is in the agreement? Well, there's, first of all, the official name and where you can find it in the official journal. And essentially, it does four things. There's plenty of housekeeping there as well, but four essential things. First of all, it sets out a transition period, which will last until end of 2020 and can then be extended for a couple of years maximum, And during this transition period, nothing much changes as a matter of law. Things broadly stay the same. And the idea is that this is then the window where you negotiate that future relations agreement. So withdrawal, transition period, during that transition period, negotiations for the future relations agreement, so that then at the end of transition, UK can very smoothly ease into its new permanent arrangement with the EU. Number two, citizens' rights. So this is about those people who have exercised their free movement rights either to move and live in the UK or UK citizens moving to one of the EU27. And the aim is to safeguard their rights so that, again, broadly, things can stay the same. Obviously, there will be no new free movement as a matter of EU rights, but those people who have exercised their rights, there is protection. Third, financial settlement. So essentially, what will the UK pay? What kind of contributions will the UK make following things that were agreed during UK's membership? And the answer is the most recent figure, 42 billion euros. 41.8, I think it was in the very most recent assessment. So that is something that the UK is committed to paying the EU as part of the withdrawal agreement. Then finally, and this is where the political issues have been the most acute, the question of trade. And here there are two answers. Answer one is that the withdrawal agreement itself doesn't really deal with trade as such, because it's part of that future relations negotiations. But the declaration on those future relations say that the aim is to create a comprehensive, ambitious, wide-ranging and balanced economic partnership. So there is a commitment, non-binding, but nevertheless an important commitment to maintaining a close economic partnership between the EU and the UK. But if those negotiations were to fail, then the Northern Irish backstop will kick in. It's a protocol attached to the withdrawal agreement, legally binding, and it sets out the kind of insurance policy. So if we can't negotiate this future relations agreement, then the Northern Irish protocol will deliver us the legal situation until an agreement is reached. And what that does is essentially it commits the United Kingdom to a customs union with the UK, with different kinds of slightly different arrangements for Northern Ireland and for the England, Wales and Scotland, with the Northern Ireland being, as the Commission describes it, in the deep end of the customs union pool, while England, Wales and Scotland are in the shallow end of it. What that means in practice is that there is regulatory alignment for Northern Ireland, which is not required for the other three nations of the United Kingdom. So that's the withdrawal agreement. But as we heard and as we know, it's not in force at the moment. So then we have to look at what happens in the absence of the withdrawal agreement. Well, again, the legal text is clear. Article 50, paragraph 3 says that 2 years after you've given your notification, you will leave if there is no agreement, and it's simply the treaty ceases to apply to the member state in question. So the treaties stop applying to the UK unless there is a unanimous extension, and this has of course been done. So At the moment, there is the extension until 31st of October. In other words, unless something is agreed, then the legal default is that UK crashes out at the end of October. There is no transition period, and that's why we often call it the cliff edge scenario. So then there's no period to negotiate some future relations agreement. It simply the treaties stop to apply. As a matter of EU law, UK becomes overnight a third country. So overnight, anything that regulates third countries in EU law will start applying to the UK. Now, we have, of course, and I'm only going to look at the preparations from the EU side. UK, of course, has also engaged in preparations. We have Commission's Brexit preparedness program, where the idea is that we need to put something in place in case this no deal scenario materializes. And the basic principle is simple: unilateral contingency measures. So this is not something that is negotiated. This is not a series of mini deals or anything like that. EU has unilaterally put in place a number of contingency measures with the idea of mitigating the most significant disruption. So Commission is certainly not promising that things will go well under this no deal scenario. It says, well, we are doing what we can to limit damage. Most of the measures are temporary, somewhere between 9 and 12 months, and there are quite a lot of them: 19 legislative acts, 63 non-legislative acts, 93 preparedness notices. So if you want to know what the situation is in your particular sector that you're interested in, Commission has a really nice Brexit preparedness page where especially those preparedness notices will give detailed guidance. And the coverage includes, and I've listed some stuff there, financial sector, transport, travel, customs, and so on and so forth, that you can read there. And it's this kind of damage limitation. Let's ensure that UK tourists can come to EU without visa for a short duration. Let's ensure that trains can continue running, that planes can continue landing. Let's ensure that we can compensate EU fishermen if they lose access to UK waters, and so on and so forth. But this is very much damage limitation. Now, let's look at then these three areas that I promised to look at. So first of all, citizens' rights. And here, well, things are not terrible, I'm happy to say. All sides, EU, UK, have taken measures. For the EU side, there is no unified EU approach as a matter of EU law. This is done by member states. However, the Commission has then sought to coordinate member states' action, give them guidance, with the essential basic starting point being that nobody who is lawfully resident in an EU member state, who is a UK citizen, should lose their lawful residence due to Brexit. And member states have then each individually taken measures. There's the example of Finland. It's the act that I've listed there, giving UK citizens who have registered their residence here the right of residence until end of 2020, and this is an act that will then expire. In the UK, we also have UK Act to safeguard EU27 citizens who live there on Brexit Day, the so-called settlement scheme, EU settlement scheme, where where EU residents in UK can apply for either settled status or pre-settled status until 30th of June 2021. And this, I think, is fully operational as we speak. So that's kind of more or less under control. Financial settlement, I don't think is, certainly from legal perspective, I don't know if there is any political agreement anyway, but from legal perspective, it is incredibly unclear. So no clarity as regards money. And as any divorce lawyer will tell you, when you start your divorce proceedings, when you start discussing money, it may get very ugly indeed. And I've just put a couple of different quotes there onto the whiteboard to show you some of the differences in view. From the EU's perspective, it's very much this is a UK obligation, that a commitment that UK has agreed to these commitments that it must respect even after UK leaves. And then there's a quote from House of Lords European Union Committee, which concludes that if no agreement is reached, all EU law will cease to apply and the UK would be subject to no enforceable obligation to make any financial contribution at all. So certainly from UK House of Lords report, the view emerges that we don't think we have any obligation, and if we do, there is no practicable way that that could be enforced as a matter of law, because ECJ's jurisdiction will end and EU law will no longer be applicable in UK courts, and good luck trying the International Court of Justice route and trying to enforce that. So that is certainly something where the legal perspective is incredibly unclear in the absence of the withdrawal agreement. Then thirdly, the trade issue. So then we fall to the WTO terms, so World Trade Organization system will then start governing the relationship, and that of course in essence boils down to two agreements, GATT, General Agreement covering goods, and then GATT covering services. The GATT system, I think, is, so goods are regulated in a much more comprehensive fashion, and you know, things would not be too terrible, although for some goods there are still significant obstacles, high tariffs. If you're a Welsh sheep farmer, you're probably going to be wiped out due to the lamb tariffs if UK leaves without a deal. Those tariffs are about 40%, and given that so much of what you produce goes to export to the mainland, it is going to be very bad news for you. But, you know, goods generally okay-ish. For services, much less comprehensive coverage from GATT. But the other thing that GATT then does is it includes a key constraint, which is the most favored nation treatment obligation, MFN obligation, which essentially says that if you give preferential treatment to one country, you have to give it to everybody else. So EU cannot, out of the goodness of its heart, decide that, okay, well, we love the Brits, let's give them a good deal. Let's unilaterally now say that we'll, for you guys, cut the lamb tariffs. If EU does that, it needs to do it for every WTO partner. And the same applies for the UK. So most favored nation, you can't unilaterally give special treatment to one party without extending it to others. Finally, what about this Northern Ireland situation where, of course, and I'm talking here from point of view of trade, but where it's, of course, critical for the peace process as well. Sort of the worry that if there is a border, that will compromise the Good Friday Agreement and the settlement or with Ireland. And here, at least to me, the situation seems incredibly unclear. I don't know what's going to happen as a matter of law. When one looks at what the Commission is saying, and I've given you a couple of quotes there from the couple of commissioners, they are saying that there does need to be a border to protect the integrity of the internal market. But we need to make sure that that border is as unintrusive as possible and as much as possible takes place outside the border zone, whether it's some kind of trusted trader schemes or logistics centers or what have you. But certainly when one looks at what commissioners are saying, it seems clear that some kind of border will be needed, and that seems to be just the matter of basic logic. Then very finally, this stuff is not going to go away. So we are going to live with this for quite some time. And I'll just leave you with a couple of quotes. First, from the European Council decision to extend until 31st of October, and recital there says, this extension excludes any reopening of the withdrawal agreement. So this is what the leaders of the EU27 decided and set down in a legal document. No renegotiation. What can be renegotiated, of course, is that future relations statement that is not binding. And then a quote from the Commission: if there would be a no-deal Brexit, we would only start negotiations with the UK about our future arrangements of living together and security and what have you, once 3 issues are sorted. And those 3 issues are the issues that I just explained: citizens' rights, financial settlement, and then trade, especially in respect to the Northern Irish border. So whatever happens, this is not going to be the end of it. In the event of a no-deal scenario, we will be negotiating these same things with the UK sooner or later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teija, and thank you very much also, Anand and Jukka, for your excellent views already. And I try to be as brief as possible to allow some time for discussion as well. And I think probably most of you have heard me perhaps even too much on Brexit already, as I've been commenting it quite extensively during the past 2 years. My task is now to look at the EU's side and the political dimensions attached to it. And if we see, or if we look at the Brexit from the EU's perspective, of course, there's nothing positive on it. I think that's the first thing. It is a really historic event, what has happened. But in that context, if we look what has happened during the Brexit negotiations, I think the EU has largely secured its key objectives, and those, of course, relate to the red lines expressed by the UK government and Theresa May earlier. And of course, the fact that the EU has been displayed remarkable unity, I think this is something which we cannot highlight, because it is really, if we look at the EU and the EU politics at the moment of several crises and challenges, the unity is not there except when we discussed the Brexit and some of the other big questions like trade. We also have noticed that the popular support for the EU has increased. There hasn't been any other exit votes, and the turnout for the European elections have also gone up. This is, of course, not explicitly or only tied to Brexit, but it is something which has happened, and it has Brexit as perhaps one of the background drivers for it. And while the likelihood of the disorderly Brexit has now grown, I think it is, however, important to think that when the successes of the EU is discussed, one element of that will be whether there will be a withdrawal agreement. If there is no withdrawal agreement, then of course we end up into the kind of a blame game, who is to blame? And we can already see some of the tenets of that if we follow the messages from the UK and also from the EU member countries. But if we then move on to the kind of where we are heading, perhaps kind of politically, and what are the political difficult questions the EU has to address during the Finnish presidency. So I think the kind of three basic scenarios are still there. So there is the withdrawal agreement possibility that it will be ratified one way or another. Then I think the second scenario is the new extension, which have been discussed increasingly during the past weeks and also, I think, the coming months. And then, of course, the no-deal scenario. If we look into the orderly Brexit, that's the EU's term, what it used, and the ratification of the withdrawal treaty, and also what already was said here by Professor Menon, that some of the tough rhetoric, I think it's also true that some of the tough rhetoric, what we now hear from the conservative leader competition, is of course partly rhetoric, and it is accustomed to the domestic audiences. And of course the key question will then be whether this will really translate into realistic objectives in terms of the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration. What is clear and what came clearly from Jukka's presentation is that the current state is that the withdrawal agreement is not open for renegotiations, and perhaps we can work on the political declaration. I think the interesting point here is that there has been very little discussion about the direction of a new Prime Minister or a new UK government when it comes to the future relations, that is the political declaration. And it's good to remind us that Theresa May actually laid those red lines of very hard Brexit. And I think the current assessment is that when she came back to the end game of the Brexit negotiations, she was moving towards a softer Brexit. But again, the current situation and the rhetoric from the Prime Minister campaign and also the slides, what we saw earlier, perhaps suggest that the harder Brexit might be in the cards of the next UK government. And this, of course, will have implications for the future relations and also for the political declaration. And actually, it underlines the need for the backstop in the withdrawal agreement. Because I think the kind of the concrete options to solve the border question in the island of Ireland, they actually relates to the sort of a softer Brexit perspective, which is partly part of the current political declaration. And if that changes, so then of course the EU has all the reason for demanding that the backstop must be there, because it is highly unlikely that the issue can be settled otherwise. And I think what was already mentioned here is that when and if the UK is opting for the harder Brexit, there is no this creates new challenges in the UK Parliament. And this puts EU, I would say, in a very difficult situation in these potential new negotiations or the new UK suggestions. Because if the EU would kind of compromise or show signs or willingness to start to think about a compromise related to its key objectives, which reflects some of the EU's key principles, that would be in the environment where there is no guarantees that actually those compromises, whatever they might be, would go through in the UK Parliament. So EU would be actually in a situation where we would show that there is willingness to compromise its principles, yet there is no certainty that those will be accepted. So what EU is then left with is a kind of a scenario where EU has no principles and those are open for bargaining. Then the second scenario, the new extension, this is of course something which is now perhaps seen as, I don't know, whether on the EU side at least, one of the most likely scenarios. And this reflects to the fact that I think the conclusion from the last April and May developments was that EU is not actually willing to pull the plug in the Brexit process. And then the other point is that there is no majority in the UK Parliament for the no deal. Yet what we saw was that there was growing frustration on the EU side related to the Brexit process, and that was, of course, direct then to the Prime Minister Theresa May. There was an argument, and it's still kind of valid argument, that actually the UK Parliament or the UK in general would act only against the threat of the no deal. And when that pressure is lifted, not much will actually happen. And now I think those arguments are growing stronger on the EU side, because what we have seen is that there was no agreement in the UK Parliament. Theresa May failed, and now there is a Prime Minister competition actually, so that is how the UK is using the extension at the moment. There is also perhaps first signs and messages suggesting that there is a kind of waning trust towards the UK, and I think this is really significant if the no deal scenario will happen. Because there were arguments during April discussions that whether, or worries expressed that whether the UK will continue to understand its position as an exiting member state. And this relates obviously to the EU's agenda. It relates to the big questions if UK is a member, like the multi-annual financial framework, the new commission, new UK commissioner if there is an extension, and how UK will behave in the EU decision-making when it has all the rights of member states, if the trust is eroding in that relationship. And then, of course, there is the argument, which grew stronger during the spring, that the Brexit is actually hijacking the EU agenda, that there are all these other important issues and crises in the EU's political agenda, yet Brexit is on the agenda, European Council meeting after European Council meeting. I think there is also an argument at the moment, or a sort of a view that if there will be a new extension, that might be actually longer rather than shorter. And I think this view relates to the assessment that this withdrawal agreement might not actually go through in this parliament, so UK might actually need more time to work on first internally in its own political system, the kind of Brexit it wants. And this is, of course, something which we then will see when we move towards the October. And then finally, a few words on the no-deal scenario. And I would also like to highlight what Jukka already mentioned here, that this is actually the default option of the Article 50 process. So if there is no UK request for extension, if there is no unanimous decision by the EU27, so it will be a no deal. In the 31st of October. And of course the likelihood of this has increased, and we have gone through all these reasons for that already in the previous presentations. And I think it's quite interesting to note that we have more and more this discussion and debate. I think many of the views emerge from London, a kind of commentators close perhaps to the Conservative Party as well, pointing out different kind of available technical solutions to mitigate the no deal, and kind of highlight that this no deal option is not necessarily so negative as has been said earlier. Then, of course, if you look at the other side of the channel, so you will see immediately opinions refuting, legal opinions often refuting actually those arguments and pointing that there is not much that the EU can do in a no deal situation. If we think about the political implications, here I return to the trust question, because I think this would be the biggest casualty of a no-deal scenario. So what will actually happen is that the trust between the UK and EU will immediately collapse, I would say. And we all know that rebuilding trust will take time, and it will also take political will on both sides. And I mean here to arrive to the situation again where negotiations about the future relations and this close partnership can be carried on. And I think if we also look at the kind of the immediate environment of a no-deal scenario, so we must remember that EU would be preoccupied, and this is the Finnish presidency as well, with the implementation of those contingency plans, which were laid out already by Jukka. And it will be also preoccupied by managing the disruptions, because of course not everything can be foreseen. There is an urgency to address new situations as they emerge. And I think then, when the time would be ripe, and this could be a lengthier period, the eventual return to the negotiation table would actually take us back to the square one. And this was also something that Jukka pointed out. So EU has already made it clear that any discussions about the future relations and finding the solutions, the EU will first demand that the citizens' rights, money, and border question in the island of Ireland will be addressed first before we can move on. So this takes us actually back where we started, and then we start to discuss those issues as well again. I will stop here now, so we hopefully have time for a lively discussion.